With the way Andrew Wiggins has looked through the first two preseason games, there's a good chance he could end up being a trade piece that ends up swinging the NBA title race. Assuming that the Miami Heat will be in a position to move him, and for a pretty solid return, ahead of the NBA trade deadline, it would give the team plenty of power and control. It's difficult to remember the last time the Heat found themselves in this position, in which they could play a big role in determining the top of the NBA hierarchy this season without necessarily directly being involved themselves. Sure, it's not exactly where the team or the fan base would want to see, but it's not a terrible consolation prize. Especially when you consider that whatever move the Heat ends up making could very well put themselves in a much better position to rejoin the title contenders in the near future. Of course, the big question remains, would the Heat actually trade Wiggins? Andrew Wiggins could be the best trade piece at the deadline. Over the course of the last few seasons, the Heat has had much difficulty with this idea of trading their veteran assets when it's time to do so. In short, the Heat has very rarely embraced the idea of being a seller at the NBA trade deadline. But after losing Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, Caleb Martin, and now even Haywood Highsmith for essentially nothing in return over the last few years, the Heat can't possibly make the same mistake with Wiggins. They can't. They won't. Right? It's tough to predict, but if Wiggins is playing at an extremely high level and the Heat are out of the playoff race, or find themselves right back in the play-in tournament picture, they'd almost certainly have to strongly consider cutting bait at the deadline. And if there's a contender that feels they're a Wiggins away from contending for a title this season, the Heat would have to seriously think about pulling the trigger on a trade. If Miami were to be offered a first-round pick in exchange for Wiggins, I can't see a world where they don't accept the offer. It's a move that could help this team tremendously in their bid to land a superstar player, via trade, in the future, and one they should be holding out for. Wiggins has gotten off to a hot start this year, and if he can carry that into the regular season, the Heat may have a great problem on their hands. And in many ways, they'll have many contenders knocking on their front door come trade deadline season. The decision to hold Kel'el Ware out of trade discussions for Kevin Durant continues to look worse and worse for the Miami Heat. Now that head coach Erik Spoelstra has called out Ware for a second time in the matter of a few months, it's almost impossible not to think that Miami may have made a huge mistake. Ware may have bounced back in a big way against the San Antonio Spurs in preseason game number 3, finishing with an eye-catching 29 points and 12 rebounds in what SPO would call a meaningful effort. But, still, it's not ideal that all this came after being called out by SPO for a second time in the last few months. It's similar to what we saw from Ware toward the end of the NBA Summer League, in which it was only after criticism from SPO that sparked renewed focus from Ware. If that is going to continue to be the pattern moving forward, it's going to be difficult to rely on Ware in any consistent way this season. On paper, Ware has had a pretty solid showing in the preseason thus far, especially after a breakout performance, but it is notable that SPO continues to micromanage Ware at almost every turn. And it could very much point to even bigger concerns that may be taking place behind closed doors. Will the Heat regret the decision to not trade Ware? Generally speaking, especially for an organization like the Heat, by the time these types of criticisms reach the public forum, it has had to have reached a boiling point behind closed doors. That's what has to be the real concern for Heat fans. If Ware can't right the ship and is more inconsistent than not, as he's been over the first year plus of his career, it's going to be difficult for the franchise not to second-guess itself for the decision to keep Ware out of the trade discussion for KD. It's impossible to know for sure if the Phoenix Suns would have traded KD to Miami had Ware been offered in a deal, but that does seem to be the growing narrative. And this could be a gutting decision for the Heat if Ware never snaps out of this early rut. Has been reinforced to me that Suns badly wanted Ware in Durant talks. That ultimately was decider. But I agree with Heat not giving him up in part because of Durant age. And you need to see how it plays out with Ware, who has a lot of talent. The Heat clearly believes in Ware's talent, and you'd imagine that's probably a big reason why SPO is so hard on him. Of course, the big question revolves around whether or not this is a tactic that will work in the long run. If this is what Ware needs to ignite him into the all-star player that the Heat believes he can be, this will end up being a well-played risk by Miami. However, if Ware never does reach his potential as a player, this is one of those decisions that the Heat could regret for years to come. After refusing to part with promising big man Kel'el Ware in their pursuit of Kevin Durant this summer, the Miami Heat may be changing course. According to the Miami Herald's Barry Jackson, the franchise would now be willing to include the 7-footer in a potential trade package for Milwaukee Bucks superstar Giannis Antetokounmpo. Where on the table, Adebayo off-limits. Jackson reported that where Miami's 2024 first-round pick and a centerpiece of their youth movement would no longer be off-limits if the Bucks ever make Antetokounmpo available. However, Jackson added that Bam Adebayo remains untouchable in any discussions. If Giannis Antetokounmpo had asked out, the Heat was prepared to make an offer that did not include Bam Adebayo, according to a source, Jackson wrote. But it's unlikely any such offer would have been seriously considered. If Antetokounmpo requests a trade at some point, it remains to be seen if the Heat would ever change its mind about offering Adebayo. Jackson also noted that Antetokounmpo shares the same agent, Octagon managing director Alex Saratzis, as Adebayo, making it unlikely the two players would want to be separated. It's unlikely that the Bucks star would want to join a Heat team without Adebayo, Jackson added. So it's all likely moot. Knicks were Giannis' preferred destination. If Miami hoped to leapfrog into contention for Antetokounmpo, they may already be behind. ESPN's Shams Charania reported that the Bucks and New York Knicks engaged in exploratory trade talks over the summer after Antetokounmpo identified New York as his preferred destination outside Milwaukee. Ever since the NBA Draft Combine in mid-May, Alex Saratzis, Antetokounmpo's U.S.-based representative, has fielded rampant interest and conducted serious due diligence on the best possible outside fits, Charania wrote. Several teams were discussed internally, but one emerged as the only place Antetokounmpo wanted to play outside of Milwaukee, the New York Knicks. Those conversations, however, never developed beyond the preliminary phase. The Bucks insisted to the Knicks that they preferred not to move Antetokounmpo, Charania reported. Milwaukee believes New York did not make a strong enough offer to continue even discussing a trade. Knicks window closes, hope for Miami? Charania later revealed on ESPN's NBA Today that the Knicks' exclusive negotiating window has closed, leaving the door open for other contenders. That window is obviously shut, Charania said. We're not in August anymore, we're now in October. If things reopen during the season with this whole Giannis Antetokounmpo element, that window is no longer exclusive to the Knicks. Other NBA teams will enter the picture. I expect it to go beyond just New York. That development could reignite Miami's interest, though the Heat would still face steep odds in any bidding war that might include the Warriors, Rockets, and Spurs, all teams with deeper draft and young talent reserves. Lessons from the Durant miss. The Heat's reported willingness to include Ware marks a sharp pivot from their stance during June's Kevin Durant sweepstakes. Charania reported at the time that the Suns engaged both Houston and Miami in trade discussions, but found each team reluctant to part with its top young prospects. The Suns' trade conversations focused on the Rockets and Heat in recent days, Charania wrote in June, but both teams showed an unwillingness to part with young cornerstones such as Jabari Smith Jr. and Reed Shepherd, Houston, and Kel'el Ware, Miami. In a Durant deal, sources said. The Heat made multiple offers for Durant but ultimately turned down the opportunity to place Jamie Jaquez Jr., Nikola Jovic, Haywood Highsmith, the number 20 pick, and other draft assets. After missing out on Durant, Miami appears determined not to repeat the same mistake if Antetokounmpo eventually becomes available. Still, without Adebayo in any package, and given Giannis' past preference for New York, the Heat's chances remain slim.